All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are live. I'm Mike King. This is Hamlet Batista. We're going to be talking about, automated testing for SEO. I'm going to get these slides up in a second. But in the meantime, Hamlet, why don't you tell them who you are and what you're up to?
Yeah, happy to be here. So I'm across the river from Mike. I'm in New Jersey, the Jersey side. And as everybody here is probably boarded up for what's going to happen in the revolution when everything is going on. So yeah, here excited to geek out with Mike. You know, we love programming, we love SEO. So we say, look, let's share some of our cars, right?
Basically super cool nerds. And everybody that's tuning in from wherever you are, please say what's up in the chat. Let us know where you're tuning in from. And yeah, very excited to have everybody here.
Yeah, I see Dre and say, woo, New Jersey. I thought you were upstate New York. Very sorry to see everybody here.
See Mike from 2U over there. Cool. All right, I'm going to start sharing my screen. And here we go. Boom. All right, so let's get this jumping. Like we were saying, I'm Mike King, and we've got Hamlet Batista here as well. He's the CEO of RankSense. I am the managing director and founder of iPullRank. So we want to talk about automated testing today. And first, I want to walk through a couple of scenarios. So have these things ever happened to you? I issued a tweet, this is a while back, where I was like, what's the wildest SEO situation that you got into due to something that a developer did? And then I got a lot of responses back. So one guy said, I can't imagine much worse than a no index tag being added to the live site. Someone said, I got threatened with being sued a week after a client signed a contract because their Google traffic went to zero. I hadn't started as they had asked me to wait a week as their site was redesigned, being finished, and then someone added the disallow to the robots.txt for everything. Someone else said, I also once had a dev let a site update go live without consulting the SEO team. So all the site architecture, schema, metas, and the whole nine were wiped out.
Wow.
Alan Bleiweiss, he said a multi-million page site having massive de-indexing, millions of pages due to bad JavaScript on relaunch, their revenue model collapsed. Ali says, reverting canonical tags to old versions of URLs. No one noticed until the old URL started showing up in GA. That's very scary. What if I told you there's a way that you can stop this from happening? Let's talk a bit about automated testing. One, what is automated testing? First, you got to get a bit of an understanding of how modern web development works. And also, as we go, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat or hit the ask the question button down, over there somewhere.
Your camera is down, Mike.
You can't see me?
No.
On the bottom left. I'm right next to you on my screen.
No, but I'm seeing the logo, the iPullRank logo.
Huh, that's weird.
Interesting.
Anyway, so I want to talk about how modern web development works. First, when you're building an application, there's a separation of concerns. So there's the model, which basically represents your data structures and your databases. There's your controller, the section of the code that handles the logic of what's happening, and then the view, what's actually displayed to the user. So if you're familiar with any of the existing libraries or some of the more popular libraries, specifically, you may have heard of React, which is generally like working on the view. You can certainly have it manage other components as well, but more often than not, people are thinking about it from just the front end perspective. If you're familiar with a popular PHP framework called Laravel, it manages all of these things, but it also can be used just for the model, so managing the data and then also the logic. And then you could have React be the view for what you're doing here. So my whole point here is that there's three different concerns that are separated in a variety of ways.
Yeah, and a parenthesis that you can think about this as modular, that now you can have also Node, you can have JavaScript on the back end as well, replacing the model and the controller. So but you have, from a conceptual perspective, that's the way that most applications are built.
Absolutely. Cool. So when you put in a URL for a website, that's converted into a route. The route is then pushed towards the structure that we just talked about, and then your page is constructed. So it tends to be a series of controllers that will say, okay, this user put in this URL. We have to then get this series of code elements to then construct this page. And so this is why it's really important that if you're doing any crawling, you need to segment that crawl, because of the fact that the different page types represent a different series of routes. So that way you can tell developers, like, okay, we're having this problem on these specific page types, so they know precisely where to go in their code base to make those adjustments.
Exactly.
To that end, waterfall just doesn't really make sense from a development approach anymore. I mean, it's very rare that we come across clients that are still using that. In fact, in most cases, clients are using a more agile methodology, and they're doing what's called continuous integration. So it's not that like everybody's waiting for one day to push code all at once. Everybody or every different team is consistently updating things based on when they want to deploy things. Hamlet, you want to add anything on CI?
Yeah, so and I wanted to mention that if you think about it, that sounds like crazy, right? How are you going to be continuously pushing live code in production, right? That's kind of like, imagine, a car race, or that, that the mechanics are, changing the tires on the as the cars are running, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this sounds really scary, if you think about, traditionally. So that's why you need the tests.
Yep.
So the way that you make sure that all these teams are not messing the site up, that can still happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that there is controls, checks, automated checks in place, so that as you continue to improve the system, if there is something that's going to break, the website, is prevented from being released.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so, that very much goes with that developer ethos that Facebook popularized, this idea of moving fast and breaking things. When you've got all these different teams deploying things, the reality of it is your thing may impact another team's thing, and you may break something temporarily. And so one of the things that you do is you deploy these pipelines that have what are called automated tests. So things that get checked every time you push out code. And so effectively you can say, if someone built this feature, it has to meet these expectations around a series of tests that we have. So the thing is that if you have something where the test is not working when you deploy the code, it can make the build fail, or whatever they're trying to push out cannot be pushed to production until it's fixed. So that's this idea of moving fast and having what we call stable infrastructure. So, if you deploy something, it works in isolation, and then you put it in the bigger application and it breaks, you do not have the ability to make that happen.
And that's why you need more than one type of test, right? Because when you're talking about something working, it works in my machine, right? It works in one isolated case.
Mm-hmm.
That's where unit testing, helps, right? But it might still break when you put it together with a whole. That's where you need, at least two type of tests, and even 3 types or more. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so those 3 types of tests, or the 3 most common tests that I come across, are unit tests, like Hamlet was just saying. Then there's integration. There's integration tests, and then there's GUI tests, or graphical user interface tests. So unit tests, you want to talk a little bit about those, Hamlet?
Yeah. So when you're writing the code, right, it's interesting the way that happens when you shift your mindset to thinking that, I have to make sure that the code actually works. A lot of times you start with the test. So the developer will write the test first. Sometimes if you're in a pair programming situation where you have 2 developers working on the same functionality, one will write the tests first. And the tests, obviously, if you write them first, they're going to fail. And the goal of the developer writing the functionality is to make sure that the test pass. So as it's writing the functionality and the test pass, only when it passes all the tests, now you have functionality that is going to work.
Absolutely. And so these are generally, built within different or specific modules within your code. And then you've got integration tests. And this is where when you start to bring things together, does the logic still hold, or are you creating issues where things just don't work the way that you expected them to? So for instance, if you are, pulling data from a database or pulling data from other parts of the code or from APIs and things like this, you can test to make sure that that works as well as you make these deployments.
Yeah, and also you think about, a lot of times systems now are distributed, right? So there's not just in one computer in one place. There's network connectivity issues that is hard. You're not going to be able to test them with unit tests. You have to load the system and start testing the communication between components across even machines.
Right. Yeah, and I like to think of this, if there's a comparison, integration test is kind of like when you crawl a site in HTML. And so you're seeing how everything comes together, but things aren't fully, executing exactly the way the user might see them. Whereas a user interface test is when you're, looking at it as though you're looking at it in a browser. Specifically in terms of the web, obviously you can think of this through the frame of, native software as well. But in terms of the web, it's as though you're looking at the fully rendered page when you're doing UI testing.
Yeah.
And so this is what headless browsers are actually for. Like we use them primarily for scraping and, automating a variety of like data extraction tasks and so on. But they are actually built for this idea of automating these tests, on the UI level, on the integration level, and so on.
Yeah, that was the original purpose. But that we humans, we always find another use for that. Right?
Absolutely. So this concept is effectively called test-driven development. Like Hamlet was just saying, a lot of times developers will write the test first, and then whatever code that they create has to adhere to that test. So if what they write doesn't work for these tests, they know it's not going to be code that they can ultimately deploy.
Exactly.
So how does this?
Sometimes it's only in theory, right? Sometimes it's hard to have the discipline to say, I'm going to write the test first.
Yeah.
But it's definitely worth it.
I mean, it definitely takes time, and then you also have to maintain all those tests as you go and so on. So, a lot of people just like to write the functionality first and then go backwards, but that always gets you into problems later.
Exactly.
Cool. So yeah, how does this apply to SEO? Well, Brittany, who used to be at Moz, she brought up a great point. She talked about, when I posted this, she was like, let's talk about how we can learn from developers. And I suspect that she said that because she didn't understand the context of why I was posting that. Obviously, I posted that question to have content for this. But nevertheless, I agree that there is certainly a lack of communication between us and development teams. And I say us as SEOs. But the more that we can work together to make these things happen, the more that we can avoid the types of issues that we saw earlier in those horror stories. So as far as those horror stories, let's go back to those a bit, right? So this first one where the gentleman mentioned that there is a no index tag everywhere, there's two ways that we could test this. We could test it as a unit test to see if there's a presence of a meta no index tag within the module's code. And you could also do it as an integration test to look for the presence of that once the page has actually been constructed in HTML. For the robots.txt, you could do the same. Again, a unit test failure condition could be if that robots.txt is programmatically generated, looking for the presence of that specific disallow, for whatever route owns that, or in an integration test where you're just looking at the robots.txt as part of it. The server-side rendering test. So this could be the type of thing where you're looking for key body content that you would expect, rendering the DOM to some degree as a UI test or an integrated test, and then looking for the features that you expect. Rel canonical, this could work the same way as what I was just saying as far as looking for items in the DOM. So this can be a unit test, an integration test, or a UI test in this case. And then in the case of someone putting an image tag in a head, again, just looking for the presence of the test on any layer of these types of tests. But I just want to be clear that this is not a magic bullet of any kind. We could certainly, in this case, this person is talking about the site architecture changing and breaking, the schema being removed, the metadata being removed. Certainly we could have tests for all these different things, but this issue right here is more a product or project management and issue where you guys got to make sure that you're actually talking to these people.
And it emphasizes, that ideally you want to have automated that you have enough tasks that you don't have to have SEOs or people. That's not realistic.
Mm-hmm.
You only can cover as much as but there's always going to be an exception to the rule. People can imagine things you never think. How did they come up with this BS that is on the website? Can't account for the imagination of people coming up with crazy stuff.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Always the human in the element is incredibly important.
Absolutely. So who usually does this work? It's usually either a developer or a QA engineer, right? And so, we often see, like Hamlet was saying, that developers will write the test cases and write the code into it. And if they don't, then a QA engineer comes behind them, and they're either doing some sort of like ad hoc level of QA, or they are coming back and being like, hey, there's not enough code coverage on this. So let's make sure that we have enough tests to support, whatever we're trying to account for what we're creating. So effectively, as SEOs, what we can define is some test cases, right? Like we can say, here are things that we want to have checks for, and then the developer or QA engineer can then write those tests to account for it, and then also fix the code when those tests fail.
Yeah, and a way that I like to approach it, right? So from a mindset, right? You join the project and you say, look, I am here to define in agile terminology the user stories of the bot, right? So typically in teams, dev teams, they're only writing user stories, thinking about the user. Oh, the user is going to click here, here, here. We say, no, but you have to think about the bot as another user, and you're writing stories because the bot has a different behavior. The bot is not going to log into pages. So the components that you have to log in, those are not in scope. So you don't have to be writing tests for those, for example.
Absolutely. And what about end-to-end tests? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so end-to-end, it's more, I like to think about the actions, right? So think about, the components, the unit tests individually. And then the actions is the full page loads, right? So that you simulate the actual clicks and navigating into different paths on the page and making sure that everything is loading correctly. The cool thing is that you guys gonna see this live. You're gonna actually see how these tests. We recorded some videos. You're gonna see this not just from a theoretical point of view, but how it actually works in practice. So it's gonna be it's gonna resonate a lot faster.
Absolutely. And looks like Deidre just said that SEOs play the role of a product manager in a lot of ways. And I agree. I agree. I think that, when you do a site audit, you're actually doing very similar work to what a QA engineer would do, in that, crawling URLs crawling HTML is kind of like integration testing, in that you're looking to see how all the logic comes together to construct the page. And then crawling JavaScript is like UI testing. So you're looking at it the way it looks in the browser to determine, what are the differences and idiosyncrasies and disparities from what you expected. So this is not new at this point. When I made this slide, it was a bit new. But this idea of using this tool called view rendered source, I think it's called, and comparing the differences between the raw and the rendered version. But actually, you actually need to take this a bit further. You've got to do this between mobile and desktop, and then also HTML versus JavaScript within the mobile context, within the desktop context.
Exactly. And this is a great example of something that you want to do in an integration test, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not component directly. You have to change the browser user agent to do that. That makes sense in an integration test, right?
Yeah. And this is actually a shortcoming of pretty much all SEO tools. I think SiteBulb does this now, but the reality of it is, if you're only looking at one context, even if you're like, okay, we're going to crawl mobile, and because Google's crawling mobile, let's ignore everything else, you're going to miss out on what those disparities are. I just did an audit, a couple of days ago, where only on the mobile, for a mobile user agent, were they showing the viewport. If you're on desktop, it didn't show the viewport at all, despite the fact that the page was responsive. And so then what I realized is, like, when I started looking at it from the mobile context, the page was actually adaptive rather than responsive. So if you came on desktop and you change your context, it would then be responsive. But if you came with your context as mobile first, it showed a completely different subset of the content. And there would be no way for you to notice that if you were just relying on a crawling tool to understand that. So yeah, I think that's a huge problem for SEO in general.
No, and I like that you mentioned that, because a lot of times people are like, oh, why do we as developers we need to learn code and we need to learn these things and that? Is that you're gonna be missing content. There are specific corner cases. You get into a developer, even though he has the technical skills, he doesn't have the context to understand that the content has to remain when you shift the mobile to desktop. Otherwise, you're going to be missing, out on the rankings, right? They don't have that context. You can see that, and you understand the nuances of what, everything that Mike was talking about, the viewports and the node and the DOM and those are developer terms, right? That's not just theory. You have to be able to look at the code on the page and understand this and understand the implications that has. Right.
Exactly. So your role in automated testing as an SEO is helping to plan out these tests. And the way it works is you figure out what the requirements are, you build a plan for how you're going to, lay out what it is that you're trying to do. And then you work directly with your engineering folks to say, okay, here's the test that we want to build. Here's my test cases. Here's my acceptance criteria. You're effectively writing these user stories specifically for the test. And then once they've built the test, we review them, and you can work with them to get the right alerting system in place so you can be aware when your tests fail. And so, we whenever we work with clients to build this out, we build out a series of test cases showing the example, and we'll say, here's a scenario. So in this first example, we're looking for the presence of a meta description tag. And this could be a unit test within a certain page type. And the tests are, just looking to make sure that that tag is there. You can look at it in the page template code itself. Your expected results would be that all URLs of a given page type will have a meta description. And in the case of, a product detail page missing a meta description, we may still make this be a pass. We don't necessarily want it to be a release blocker, but it may be a warning in that case. Whereas if we want to do something like determining whether or not there are viable internal links on a page type, we would render a representative sample of URLs during this build phase, and then we would open all the internal links and review the response codes. If they are all 200s, then we're all good. If we've got a series of internal links to 404s or 301s, we might make that fail the release, and then they would have to go back and fix it.
Yeah. That's
so awesome. Yeah. And so, as far as different tools that are out there, I'll let you speak to this, Hamlet. There's a variety of things that are available.
Yeah. So it depends on a lot. It depends on the tool set of the dev team, but a lot of times if they have a tool, you don't have a say into what tool it is. But that's what it's good to get familiar. The most popular is Jenkins. It's it's a Java based. Used to be something that you install it and deploy it on servers. You have to set up servers. Now it's more popular to have cloud based solutions. We particularly use Circle CI, but there is now GitHub also has a CI.
Actions.
It's called the Actions. Which I like it a lot. It's great. There is Travis CI. There's all the tools that you can use. But fundamentally, what they do is that you create a YAML file. We're going to look at that. And you describe the setup of the environment to replicate the environment for the test. Download and set up the packages. And then all the tests. It will run the tests in sequence. And at the end, it uses a Unix convention that the exit of the program at the end, if it's 0, it's okay. If it's not 0, it's an error. And that simple convention let the system that is running the testing sequence know if there's something that has to halt. And we're gonna see that. So it's gonna be really cool.
Yeah, and for those of y'all that are doing things in like Jupyter notebooks and Colab, it's kind of, think of it as kind of similar to that, in that when you get somebody's templated notebook and you just like, press Control Enter or whatever, and it just goes through everything and then gives you a result at the end. That's kind of the same thing that a test is doing, in that, you've got a series of criteria that it tries to execute. And if it executes it successfully, then you get, a 0. And if it doesn't, you get a non-zero response. So not the same thing at all, really, but just think of it as like, you get a Colab notebook, you open it up and you try to run it, and then you get an output at the end. It's kind of the same idea.
Yeah.
So if you're using Jenkins, and I know that, all these other tools have something very similar, but Jenkins has a direct plugin with Slack. And so you can get alerted to the failed tests, directly in Slack. So you can work with your developers to say like, hey, I've got a series of tests that we've implemented. Let's integrate this with Slack so that I get alerted that things are broken, so I can, give you guys a fix or whatever, or just be aware of that so you can account for it in your analytics and things like that, and understand that it could have been a release that broke your SEO rather than, an algorithm update. And if you don't want to use Slack, you can also just use the logs that Jenkins has natively, or you could pipe those logs into MySQL and visualize in any way that you want. So beyond that, you're also going to need, oh, go ahead. Okay. You're also going to need some sort of like internal crawling mechanism, because as part of the pipeline, you're going to want to spin up a certain number of pages representing, every page template, and make sure that it's operating the way that you want. So when we're talking about things like these integration tests, we're talking about things like these UI tests, you would need crawlers to support that. And so the way that we work with clients to build this is, build these in a serverless way so that they don't have to maintain a server. It's the type of thing where, you send it to an endpoint, and whether that's like 50 pages or 100 or whatever you want, it'll then respond back with that data so we can make it as fast as possible.
Yeah, and I have tested sometimes these Lambda functions and Cloud functions, they have limited environments of what you can actually run, but I have been able to successfully test headless browsers. They have the components that make it, viable to run them for that, and makes it also very cost effective because you only pay for the run.
Exactly. So some quick tips on testing: make sure that only the critical SEO tests fail to build, because otherwise your developers will start removing tests and be like, every time I run this, it fails my build. Most of your SEO issues will be spotted in your integration tests rather than unit tests. Obviously, you can spot the same issues in the UI tests, but those are going to be slower, so it's better to do it at the integration layer. Make sure you're including these SEO tests in every build, otherwise it kind of defeats the purpose. Keep your testing suites separate from the core code, and then do any crawling that you have to do for this in parallel. So again, this idea of using these serverless architectures, you can just send a bunch of URLs at them, and then they will load balance as required.
Yeah, but it's always good to point that you don't want to do a massive list. Just a few, less than a handful of example by page type. Because if you have a site with 1 million pages, it's obviously gonna slow down. The developers are gonna hate you because you're, delaying the builds by hours or even days. You have to wait for
the Cool. So Hamlet coded some tests.
Yeah, let's get to the coding part, right? So let's get to the next slide, right? So for this, I think about a year ago, I put together to illustrate this, a Angular-based JavaScript application to show you all this stuff we're talking about in practical terms, right? So let's get to the next one, right? So you'll be able to find it on this repo, RankSense/gtrends/watch. Yeah, I don't know if I have control of that. And basically what this app does is it scrapes, uses Google Trends, right? and we want to visualize, grab the Google Trends and visualize them in it will be like a Google Trends monitoring app, right? But it's not, live. It was a set of stories that I collected. Let's get to the next one. And let's see what it looks like. You want to hit play? Yeah. See that?
Weird.
Yeah, it should be there now.
Hold on.
Yeah, let's see what the app does. Yeah.
All right, let's do that for that.
So yeah, so this is, the topics, the categories from Google Trends, and it gives you a quick way to see the trending topics. You can click on different elements. So you see, I wanted to make it as live, as realistic as possible. So you have routes, you have, functionality, you can search. I wanted to add the search so that we can also identify elements that are not in scope of SEO, right? But this is a functioning app. Hopefully it still works after I built the last year. Make sure to check it out and let me know if it does. And at the same time that I built it, I wanted to also optimize it for SEO. Make sure that I set the meta tags. You see that by default, it doesn't come with canonical tags, but I was able to set that up. This is with our Chrome extension. You can see that this functioning app, right? Let's get to the next. Let's get to the code. So you require, I think it was with Angular 4 and Node.js 8 for this one to make sure that it works. So let's get to the next one. So how do you set, so the unit testing is the tools that you use are obviously going to be dependent on the tech stack. We're using Angular, we're using JavaScript. Jasmine is perfect for writing unit tests. Makes it very simple because you can write them in a descriptive way. You're saying descriptively what should happen, right? And let's see how the code looks, right? So this is the run of the test. So this is after you set up the test, you can do NJ test. So React, you have a similar, and Vue, all of them have tools. Now, when I run the test, that's as simple as you run it, right? You build the app. And the main difference when you're running unit tests is that it's checking the components. I don't know if it's too small to see what it's doing, right? But you see that it's loading the browser, and you see that the spinning wheels is using Karma here, connected to the browser with the app loaded, and it's checking the components. As the components load, the components have the control over a specific meta tags that we're checking here, right? So that's the run. We're checking, and this is what the test, for example, for missing meta tags looks like, right? It should have call set canonical. So if it doesn't call it, if the component that is supposed to set the canonical doesn't run, right, it's gonna fail the test, right? So and as I said, when you have this kind of knowledge, right, it builds such a great credibility with the developers. When you go to them, hey, it's not, I run the crawl, it's not working, but you can point them to where is the problem, right? Think about how faster that's going to be prioritized. Or if they have 100 other things, you say, no, I know exactly what is it that you need to fix, give it. And if you're even, they even, they are give you commit access to the repo, right? Which is, it will be the ideal, right? Oh, why don't you patch it yourself? Send me a pull request, right? That will be even, even more awesome, right? But this is valuable because if they allow you to make changes to the code base, you need to make sure that your code actually passes the tests as well, right? So let's get to the next one, right? So what are the components that require unit testing? So this is how you think about the components in a web page. So Mike was talking about the views, right? The controller, the model, the view. Within the view, right, you have a hierarchy of components, and one component is nested within another, right? And this is the hierarchy within that. And you wanna be able to understand it and see this. There are tools for example, for React, there are plugins or Vue or Angular that can actually show you this. You install the extension, it will show you how these components are broken down internally, right? And some components, like for example, when we talked about, when you're logged in, right, they are not in scope of SEO because you have to be a logged in user to see the admin interface. The admin interface, all the components in the admin's interface, you don't need to even worry about those, right? So let's get to the next. So then we have, for integration testing, we have in Angular, we have this tool called Protector, right? And it's about, okay, now I have the components, how do everything fits together, right? And we were talking about the rendering on mobile versus desktop, right? So this needs to be able to simulate not just loading the components past the test, but simulate actions. And you'll see how that looks. Let's see the video on that one, right? Very similar idea, right? And this is why I encourage you to do these tutorials, whatever stack your app is built, if it's Angular or whatever. Play with the tutorials, learn to build a simple app, test it yourself. So it's a lot more that you learn when you're doing this stuff and you actually see it working. So much you can learn from this. So here we run the end-to-end tests and the suite actually builds the app. Very similar. It's going to load the browser, right? And you see, once this loads the browser, you see that it says that Chrome is running, it's being controlled, right? Now look how cool it is. It's simulating actions. So it's a different thing than just loading the app and checking all the components loaded. Here it's actually clicking, opening pages, doing things that you define yourself, right? And while it's running this test, right, it's checking that the meta tags are there, right? That the behaviors that you expect to happen from an SEO perspective are there. So essentially, run the simulation of the Google bot, right? Very cool. As I said, we have this in the repository, and there's instructions. You can reproduce this that I just described by running the instructions in the repository. And then at the end, you'll see that it's everything checked, right? All the changes that we wanted were there, right? So what are the actions? As I mentioned, searching, search engines are not going to be performing typing a search or scrolling, right? So those are the things that you want to take into consideration. Let's get to the next one, right? And this is one example that we talked about, right? End-to-end tests, perfect for this critical problem that we mentioned about the difference in content between mobile and desktop, difference in content between rendered JavaScript content and not rendered, right? And being able to set this up and make sure that you check the test, that you have the test set up, or even provide instructions to the developers so that they know that this is something that they should be doing, right? Super critical. Let's get. So now let's talk about that test, that horror story that we talked about the hreflang. Somebody put an image tag in the head, and then the hreflang tags disappear. That's not just the hreflang tags. That's a generic problem that in the head is illegal, invalid to put tags that only belong in the body, right?
I feel like illegal is the right word. They definitely should be arrested for doing that.
Exactly. That's the right word. So what I did, let's show you one experiment that I performed to understand this, right? And theoretically, okay, yeah, this shouldn't be the case, but it's not the case from Googlebot perspective. Guess what? That's something that we can test. We have the tool, the Hero Inspection tool. I set up a test page, and I, on purpose, I started breaking the HTML. I said, okay, let me see what happens if I remove the body tag, right? And look what happened. In the inspection tool, showed me that Google, if I remove the body tag, Google added it back in, right? And that's a normal behavior that browsers do to deal with broken HTML. Okay, you don't have a body tag, but I see a body. You didn't add the actual HTML body tag, but I see a body element, and I see an element that only belongs in the body. I'm going to assume that this is where the body starts. That's why they do it, right? So they added it immediately. Let's get to the next one. Now, look what happens. I added the div manually to the HTML head, right? Look what happened with the canonical. The canonical that was, if you look at the view source, it looks like the canonical is in the head, but because this div that was inserted in the HTML in the head tag caused the parsing process to push it down, because it assumed that you didn't know, you forgot to add the body tag, so that's where it pushed it down. Now the canonical is in the body, where we know it's not going to have any effect because that's not where the search engine is expecting it. So something as simple as that has SEO implications, right? A user might copy a tag that they got from a third-party vendor, maybe within the tag, it has an HTML about it, and the tag was meant to be in the body. The user put it in the head, and that caused your SEO to go to the trash, right? Any tag that was below that insertion is going to disappear from the site, right? Let's get to the next one. And then I said, okay, let me do something more sneaky. Let me not put it explicitly in the HTML, but let me have a JavaScript do the insertion. So have the JavaScript dynamically modify the head to insert this illegal element. And we also had a problem. In this case, it wouldn't render, but you can assume that it also had a problem to be able to parse it as well. Right, let's get to the next one. And now, this is how you fix it. A simple fix when that happens is to shift the HTML, is to list the SEO tags right at the top, right after the opening head tag. If you list them right there, the chances of them getting ignored is minimal because the breakage is going to happen right after, right? That's kind of like a quick and dirty fix. Ideally, you want to fix the script, but this one will fix it by just moving them to the top. Right? And this is the beautiful thing about having these tools. They can show you precisely whether Google picked up the declared canonicals. And a lot of times you say, why is Google not, accepting my canonicals? Why is the canonicals just a hint? Because of things like this. Google has to have the ability to say, okay, no, I consider this canonical setup a mistake. I'm going to ignore it, right? And hopefully they think they know better. Sometimes they do, other times they don't. Let's get to the next one, right? And as I said, the optimal is that you shouldn't have these illegal things in the HTML, tags in the HTML, right? Let's continue here. So how do we detect this? And that's where we get some, for the Python fans in the audience, we get some Python code here. This is the code that can help you detect it, right? Here's the link. And basically what this is doing is finding in the second function, it goes in the DOM and looks for the canonical. This is just an example with the canonical, but you can do it with any tag. It will search for it in the whole DOM. If it's found in the HTML head or in the body, it's going to find it because it's doing a relative search. Now, after I find it, what I do is I build the path backwards. Okay, I found the element. Now I want to find where it is in the DOM by looking backwards recursively, and I can build a path. Now that I have the path, I know if it was in the head or in the DOM or in the body. And then based on we're using that check in our automated tests, we can prevent this critical problem from happening, right? This is why this is so important and why I wanted to go through this level of detail to you to show you nuanced things like this. Think about it, the knowledge from a development perspective that you need to identify an issue like this to have an impact in SEO, it's not something a developer will know. They wouldn't know even to check for this or even why this will be a problem, right? You come to the picture with this knowledge from a developer perspective and an SEO perspective, and you can bring a lot of value to the team, right? Really cool stuff. Let's get to the next one. And another thing that is super critical in testing is test coverage, right? So what parts of the code base are missing tests, right? And there are tools for this, right? In this case, we're using this called Istanbul. But basically, these tools can verify every component, every piece of code in the code base and give you a percentage, ratio of how much of the code is covered by tests and how much it isn't. And in your purpose is, it's never, the idea, I want to have all the code with 100%. No, you want to make sure the critical parts of the code, especially for SEO, the code that is in scope for us that affects SEO, you want to make sure that it's covered with SEO tests, right? That's the idea. Let's get to the next one, right? and this is the tool. So I don't have a video showing you this, but here's the link to check it out. Similar to the other tools, makes it super simple to do the check and the visualization of the reporting of which code bases with code and components of tests, right? And finally, I want to show you a video of what an actual production test looks like. This is our code base. We ran it a couple of years ago. It's a model in SQL CI when you see how the test is set up, setting up the environment. The code also checks out the code from the repository, from the correct branch. And a lot of these systems use Docker to simulate the environment internally, set up all the dependencies. And this, we were doing it in a computer vision model that we were testing for taking the structured data. So it sets up the ML environment for that. And here it was the failure, right? Sometimes, there's connectivity problems. So sometimes the test is not because it's a problem, they have to be retested. But here you can see, right, the test, and you can also see the successful ones, right? And you can see different team members pushing code. Every time somebody pushes code to the code base, it runs through the tests to make sure that they're not breaking something or stepping in somebody else's toes, right? As I said, and we promise, you'll see this not just theory, live production, work, the value of this technique and work. So I think we're good on that.
Cool. So let's tell them who we are and where we're from. I'm Mike King from iPullRank. That's all I got.
Great.
And you are?
Hamlet Batista from RankSense. And you have the other. So at RankSense, we have a SEO automation, technology. We call it Agile SEO. You can implement changes in the CDN as experiments. And we're happy to hear your questions here.
Cool.
I think we have like 5 questions, right?
Yeah, we got 5 questions. Let's just take them as they came in. So what is missing in the automated SEO testing space for tools?
What is missing?
Mm-hmm.
I think that, we're missing more commercial tools. I think that Deep Crow has one. I think they're probably the first.
Yeah, they just pulled it out. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I haven't seen a demo yet, but it's probably really, really great people. JR, he has an open source tool as well. We should have, mentioned it here. And same thing with Deep Crow. So I think we're starting because it's just that the concept is so new, right? So, Mike wrote, spoke about this a couple of years ago. Was Mike? I talked about it, last year. So the awareness hasn't been there yet.
Mm-hmm.
But we're hoping that the tools will catch up, because this is a very important space, because a problem catched in development, a defect, an SEO defect that can cause traffic loss, revenue loss. If you catch it during development, that's orders of magnitude impact that you're saying. If you catch it in development versus catching it in production, at least 10, 100 times impact catching it early, right? So we're going to see that.
And I think the way that SEOs generally look at this is from the outside, using like monitoring tools rather than looking at this at like the build phase. So I think, for a lot of them, that's enough. Like they have something that runs once a day, so they know like, oh, this is a problem. And so they can go back to developers that way. But I agree with you that it's way more powerful. Yeah, I agree that it's more powerful to do it proactively, so that while people are actually working on the code, they can just make those adjustments.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's more of the awareness and people getting too comfortable, right? And if you see what Mike and we've been doing and pushing, development and coding and AI and deep learning, is that we've been, as an industry, too complacent. We're not pushing the tool vendors. And I'm a tool vendor, and I want to be pushed. I want to be challenged, so that people are not a status quo. Oh, this is the best we can do, because there is economic impact, and we can be taken a lot more seriously if we can show, hey, look, I saved the company $100,000 just because between one day and the other, I catch the problem before it costs to begin with, right?
Yeah, and this is why I have been pushing this idea of establishing like technical standards for SEO, because you know there are so many things that our tools are not doing that they need to do for SEOs to be continually effective. Like this idea of diff crawling that we talked about earlier, I think that is an absolute requirement moving forward. And I wish that we had these standards set up where like every SEO tool vendor had to adhere to that, because there's just a lot of people that don't know the implications of that.
Yeah, another way, Mark, is by embarrassment, right? We're showing, that, developer that, oh, you don't want to build a functionality. I'm learning Python. I'm doing it myself, right? I'm showing, I need this. I can make it happen myself, right? But not just being stuck in the past of, oh, this is all we can do, right? So I think, and I'm, excited to see, as I mentioned, Dipro, you see JR, doing efforts to show that, and the market is massive. There is a lot of opportunity, but we as an industry have to be aware of these things and push for change, push for demand for better access to information, better awareness, and better tooling, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And James, definitely we are going to send out the recording, especially to the people that missed it and people attending, of course, as well. So the next question is, what are the best testing tools for Python? I know the unit test tool is just built in, but what are some other things that you recommend?
So I don't know that you can say, tools for Python is a generic programming, the test can be written in any language, and if you're talking about Python, you might be saying, oh, Django or Angular, so you're saying, what are the web apps built? And then what is the tech stack? It might be Python, it might be Django, it might be, Ruby, the tools for testing are going to be tied to the tech stack, right? So for Java, there is, JUnit. For, PHP, there is PUnit, right? Or XUnit. I mean, you just Google them and you're going to find the specific unit test, integration test for the tech stack that you use to build the app, right? Now, the scripting of the test, right? You can use Python. You can use, even a lot of times we write the test in simple shell scripts, checking if a directory is there, so you can write them in any programming language, the actual tests. But the framework to run the tests and report the test is going to be tech stack dependent.
Gotcha. All right. What process, and I think this is bigger than what we're talking about here, but what process have you automated that has saved you the most time, and which you spent more time trying to automate without any luck?
So I think that needs a little bit of context of.
Yeah, I think this is more than just automated testing. It sounds like just general automation. Like, what is something that is valuable?
There's a trade-off, obviously. Exactly. There's a trade-off between how much effort it takes to automate something versus, the actual savings that you're going to have. So I gave a webinar for SEMrush. It's finding my slide share. I think the second slide is like a cartoon from XCD guys that said, it has like a matrix of how long it takes to write the automation versus how much time it's going to save. So the rule of thumb is that if you're automating things that you only do once every couple of months or every month or once a year, it makes no sense. So try to automate things that are happening with a certain frequency that the benefit of the automation is going to outweigh the development time on coding the automation or the investment on the automation. It's a simple rule of thumb on that to make sure that's the case. But what valuable things from automation, I mean, think about, I wrote, probably now a couple of dozen articles in SCJ about a lot of different use cases of automation that, writing meta descriptions, writing title tags manually, it's a lot of work. And it's possible to automate that. You can, it's not a theory. I have articles, automating structured data. I have articles to show you that.
Otherwise, or in other words, Hamlet is saying, Google me, son. I got stuff out there.
That's put it in mildly, right?
So I mentioned what I think is missing with respect to like diff crawling, but what do you think is missing from the crawling space for tools?
So, but maybe you can answer that, Mike. You're more familiar with different crawlers and stuff, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, like I said, I think it's largely just the different contexts and being able to compare those easily. I think that there are better visualizations that can be done with that data. I think that all those crawling tools need to make it easier to move your data from place to place. I mean, we can talk about this for several hours, but I think those are three of the main things that need to be fixed in our SEO tool space.
Yeah, man, I can mention, I gave a talk at We Love SEO, and I was showing how you can combine different tools like OnCrawl with SEMrush and with our tool as well to complete automated workflow. I think something that I think would be beneficial is if the crawl vendors, right, can offer those packages for serviceless applications off the shelf. Right, so oh, you want to run our crawl on a serverless environment on a schedule or something. Here's a piece of code that you can repurpose to do that, right? And that will save us, so everybody's, and if it's in Python, even better, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you can actually deploy it, in the cloud infrastructure and not be tied to the UI, because the UI is for a generic use case, but you might have something very customized and specific. That I think will be really cool.
Gotcha. So this last question, I'm not really clear on what the gentleman Kevin means by it. So Kevin, if you can clarify in the chat, that'd be helpful. But he asked, why do you think off-page automation has not evolved much in the last 15 years? And how can we automate off-page without becoming spammy? So it sounds like he wants to automate link building.
Yeah, he's probably talking about, there's some names from those black hat tools that post
like XRumor and all that.
XRumor and all that stuff. I mean, it's just there. The why they haven't progressed is because Google doesn't. It's they're hitting against Google. They're hitting against a Goliath that is actively fighting that type of activity, right? So they are investing heavily, and if you saw the video from Google, they're spending probably half of their time just fighting that type of stuff because they don't want it. They don't want artificial reputation to happen. So yeah, you're talking about companies that are really small competing with a giant that has a motivation to keep the results clean. I don't see how that is going to be successful in the long run.
I think you're absolutely right, but I do think that right now there's probably like a small window in time where tools like that could be updated using the NLG tools. And what I mean is, like, if someone built a big list of sites where you can contribute blog posts, right, that have do follow links or whatever, and then you automate using like a GPT-3 or something like that to generate like an actual blog post, you could potentially do a better form of what XRumor does right now. But I agree that no matter what, none of those are going to be long-term tactics that could be leveraged.
Yeah, and he's saying that he's concerned about why had link building, if such a thing exists. So I think if you're thinking about why had, you're probably thinking about our friend, what is this outreach tool?
BuzzStream,
Pagebox. So you're thinking about that kind of pitching bloggers and journalists, topic articles and stuff like that. That's kind of like a smart CRM, right? So I think that industry can evolve like the CRMs. The CRMs are using AI, and there's a lot of stuff, but that's always going to be, as I see it, a very human driven industry, because I get a bunch of pitch, people from LinkedIn. Oh, I'm guess what? I'm a guest blogger, and I want to get you on this and that. It's tough, right? It's tough. The automation on that side of the industry that is primarily, yeah. So you see, so I was saying, pitching journalists and stuff like that. So maybe Mike, you can share some of that, your experience. box and where you see areas that could be improved.
Yeah, I love Pitchbox. I also like BuzzStream as well. One of the tactics that we devised is using chatbots to automate the overcoming of objections for
Yeah.
our client or the people we reach out to. And so the way we do it is we use just to like make it easy for whoever wants to deploy it. You can use Monkey Learn to classify emails that you get back. And so the first thing to know is that outreach for link building is exactly the same as outreach for outbound sales.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can use the same tools to like classify what's coming in, right? So Monkey Learn has a classifier that'll say this email is somebody that's interested, this is email is someone that's not. And then you can use Dialogflow to build a chat bot to automatically answer what those objections are. So as an example, if someone says, oh, well, we only do links if you pay for it, you can have a response that goes with that, and it can extrapolate from what you put into it to be able to determine, you know, what is this message saying, and then you can say whatever your response is. And so what you can do is using Zapier, just to keep it as simple as possible, is you plug in your email so that all emails that come in then go through Monkey Learn, and then based on those responses, you then hand that off to Dialogflow, and then you can have it go back to Gmail and automatically send a response email to it. So that way you can both label your emails and automate your responses, and then only focus on the emails where there are people that actually are interested. So that way you just get automated segmentation and then automated responses for people that aren't interested.
Exactly, which is, it's pretty much what you describe. You can replace link building for sales, right? Outbound sales. It's so you can look at that industry, because that's a massive investment and a lot of products and tools in that industry, and you can see what are the gaps when you're approaching the same thing for approaching link journalists and bloggers and people like that. So yeah, that's wonderful and a fantastic
Absolutely
response to that.
Absolutely. So we're at time, but there's one more question that I know you have an answer to. So I'm going to end it with this. Do you have a recommendation to automate Lighthouse performance testing for multiple domains and different page types?
Yeah, absolutely. I wrote an article. Yeah, I gave a presentation for Brighton SEO. So you have a deck that shows you that. And in the article that I published, the last one for SCJ, even though it's specifically about how to do that with WordPress, but you can just generate the list. It's a part of on the question that you can have links. You can create the list for as many sites as you want.
So again, in other words, I already did it. Google me, dog. So Hamlet, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and all the things that you've been doing in the space. It's been really remarkable to see the things that you've contributed over the last few years. And I know you've done a lot in the background as well. Like you were technical editor of some of the biggest SEO books and so on. So I'm very excited to see the things that you continue to do. I'm learning a lot from you and very excited to have had you today.
Likewise, it's been a privilege as well. And thank you for having me. And looking forward to more collaborations 2020. We still have a lot of work to do, right?
Yes, indeed. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We'll send out the email. We've got more things coming with Rankable and additional webinars and so on. So lots to cover and looking forward to sharing more stuff with you. Have a good one.
Great.